Now please welcome to the podium Regina Bradley, former fellow professor of literature at Armstrong State University.
Hello. You better be glad it just skipped. I do apologize for, oh, thank you. I do apologize for my voice. I have what me and my husband call the ick. So I don't know what it is, but it's not letting me be great. So I do apologize for sounding a hot mess. But I am super excited and I would not miss this for the world. So I guess the professional rundown of John Jennings, our speaker for today, is that he is a professor of media and cultural studies at UC Riverside. He is a board member of the Black Scholar. He's artistic director and a board member of the brand spanking new Sons book series that focuses on speculative fictions with Ohio State Press. And he's also a founding theoretician of the critical race design studies, which is he is here at Harvard to further develop. But more so than that, John Jennings is a tinkerer. He likes to work through things. He considers himself a son of the black noir. He makes ideas tangible and the unexpected becomes the ordinary. His artistic prowess is a reflection of his southern upbringing in Flora, Mississippi, so shout out to the South. John Jennings has an uncanny ability to recognize and illustrate the ancestral and cultural ties that bind us to our everyday experiences. And this is reflected in his most recent New York Times best-selling
Thank you.
the graphic novel adaptation of Octavia Butler's novel Kindred. And if you don't get it, you need to go get it and get your entire life. John Jennings' brilliance, more specifically his genius, lies in his ability to see past the veil, to make visible the vulnerabilities, the taboo, and the possibility of Black folks, with particular attention to the American Black South. Today, Jennings will take us on a journey to the Cybertrap, a futuristic speculative space that begs the question, what do we really know about the dirty South? The trap is grimy. It tells a tale that too many folks don't want to hear. You will clutch your pearls. But they want to understand it no less. Without further ado, it is my great joy and privilege to introduce my friend, my partner in crime, my brother, the country fried genius, that is John Jennings.
Oh, he's like, she up here cutting onions. That's, whew, all right. Thank you for that. That's really wonderful. I'm trying not to get mushy and try not to go off script too much. No, seriously, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I have to live up to that, right? Thank you for coming. Seriously, thank you so much. I would like to start out by thanking Professor Gates and Professor Morgan and everyone at the Hutchins Center for allowing me to come and work in this amazing space with such an incredibly diverse and brilliant cohort of scholars. And it's been marvelous so far, so thank you for that opportunity. I'd also like to thank Krishna Lewis and Abby Wolf, because they are amazing. Some of my partners in crime, thank you, Regina Bradley, Stacey Robinson, Tim Fielder, and David Brame, Chris Lee. I'd also like to do a shout out to Marvin Bratton, Tawana Jennings, my lovely wife in the corner over there, Stanford Carpenter, and my research assistant, Zoe Smith, for helping me in developing some of the ideas around the cybertrap space that we're going to talk about today. So this is how it's going to go. So the first part of the talk is mostly about how I came to think about this notion of the cybertrap, or this conundrum of the cybertrap. So that's what the first part is, right? So once you see the timeline, after all of that, everything else is made up, okay? So everything else is totally fictional, okay? But I'm gonna talk about it like it's not. I just wanna let you know. The other thing is I wanna do a geek read right quick. So, because I'm a geek, I'm a massive geek. You know, hip hop scholar, definitely, but I'm also like a massive geek. So Star Wars, I wanna get a reading. How many people heard of Star Wars, seen it? Okay. I know, right? There's a lot of people. More than you would think. Let's see, so another read. All right, so if I say the word Gallifrey, how many people know what I'm talking about? I want to see, like, stick them up. Let me see. All right, cool. All right, so how many people have read The Star Is My Destination? Okay, good. I want you to see what my geek meter is. All right, because that's real key. All right, so I'm gonna start talking about cell therapy. You were listening to some trap music that was coming on. One of the songs was Cell Therapy by Goody Mob. And basically, cell therapy is a transmedia, Afrofuturist inspired narrative situated in a critically dystopic black design fiction space represented in a post-apocalyptic future, Jackson, Mississippi. It is also an example of cli-fi or climate fiction, a subgenre of primarily speculative fiction that deals with climate change and our society's negative effects on the world and its environments. So a lot of people always ask you, like, how did you come to this work? Or how did this work come to you? Here are some examples of some pretty popular climate fiction pieces. One I want you to pay a particular attention to is Sherry L. Smith's Orleans, which is actually set in a post-apocalyptic New Orleans. Her mother was a survivor of Hurricane Katrina and inspired her to come up with this particular type of story. I haven't read all of it because I didn't want to be influenced by it too much, but from what I could tell, it's actually really excellent. So, think about this notion of remix. I'm a hip hop scholar, but I don't know every word to Juicy by Biggie Smalls. I'm so sorry. I don't study that. I know. It's terrible, right? In the 90s, I was a really huge Soundgarden fan, actually. I can sing every note to like Black Hole Sun, right? That's right. I know. But here's the thing, though. One thing that attracts me to hip hop culture is the cultural production of remix, right? This notion of taking something, sampling it, rejuxtaposing it. The syncretic nature of hip hop is something that I think is eternal, and that's what draws me to the work, right? I still like Black Hole Sun a lot. Right? So, for the last 18 years, I've taught graphic design on the university level, and to some degree, I've managed to design myself a space for in that particular place. And to a certain degree, that place was never meant for someone like myself or my culture, right? Designing while black has forced me to invent ways to interrogate the field of design in the classroom. For instance, creating a class about visual culture and hip hop in a design studio. So one way I've done that is through looking through the lens of hip hop as an epistemology, examining sampling, remix, reappropriation, and pastiche as visual production methods. So then taking those methods and applying them to pedagogy and other theoretical endeavors. Remix for me now is a way of seeing, shout out to John Berger, and making sense of the world. I'm a CJ, and the world is my crate. So this notion of sampling or remixing is something I'm really, really into. As far as like the idea of equivalence, for instance. Something can be easily replaced with something else. You know, that's something I think is really interesting to me. So I'm always looking for connections instead of like things that divide us. So however I've managed to make the space for myself and for others, design as a practice is still mostly a very corporate-driven force that in some ways causes more harm than good. Design normalizes systems, and most systems are created to control us and regulate us in one way or another. So now I create narratives that employ the same methods that design propaganda does, but I want to make you think about the fantastic, whether good or ill, and how it affects your life and your world. Because in order for us to survive, the world must change. It reminds me of this particular quote by Sun Ra. The impossible attracts me because everything possible has been done and the world didn't change. So I've been really fortunate that a lot of my work has been associated with what has been called Afrofuturism. And some of the texts that have dealt with this particular resurgence of this culture have some of my artwork connected to it. And I've been pretty fortunate in that fact because of the wonderment and the political aspects of what Afrofuturism is. That is using an Afrocentric view of science fiction, fantasy, speculative culture, these types of things. This is a wonderful book, by the way, published by Rosarium Publishing. Bill Campbell is the publisher and co-editor of it. So as a result, I get to spend most of my time talking about black futures. And again, my work has been on some really incredible books, I think. However, up until recently, I still felt that design didn't have what I needed to make me feel as what I was doing in that area was truly helping the many issues we face in the society. And what I mean by that is when you're spending time in a design studio and most of the students who are in there leaving are going to leave with a portfolio and probably end up working at a marketing firm or advertising agency if you're doing advertising work, right? And so that type of work usually is pushing products or things or ideas that we don't necessarily need, feeding that particular type of corporate interest, right? And that can wear on you. So let me talk about Chris Lee, who is a good friend of mine who now works at University of Buffalo, and this notion of speculative design. So we're interviewing Chris, and he has the designer glasses on, he has a really sharp haircut, and he's talking about his work. He uses speculative design to talk about future currencies, speculative currencies, worldwide transnational currencies as like Bitcoin and Cypher and things of that nature. And I had never heard of this term before. Now I've heard of speculative fiction, right? We've all heard of speculative fiction. Speculative fiction is a type of fiction that deals with things that are not reality, right? So magical realism, horror, the supernatural, fantasy, things of that nature, right? Everything that are kind of superhero stories, things about cyborgs and witches, all of that is speculative, right? So I knew what that is. So I got it from the Wikipedia. Yeah, I spelled that right. So as soon as I saw this term speculative design, I went and read everything I could on it. Luckily, there were only like 3 books out there about it. So here's the thing. So, and 2 of them were by the same design team, Dunn and Raby. They're a partnership out of England, and they do a lot of work in industrial design around what's called speculative design. So the first book is called Hertzian Tales, where they put forth this notion of critical design. That is, design that is created to critique a particular problem, that kind of thing, right? Their second book, Speculative Everything, is basically a series of case studies that look at how do you intersect design thinking with speculative fiction or speculative fictions, that kind of thing. This is directly from their book on page 52. And I felt like it was speaking to me because, again, I've been teaching in this area for a while, and I do see that a lot of things haven't shifted as far as like how the industry functions, right? So I'll read this for you. Rather than giving up altogether, though, there are possibilities for design. One is to use design as a means of speculating how things could be, speculative design. This form of design thrives on imagination and aims to open up new perspectives on what are sometimes called wicked problems. To create spaces for discussion and debate about alternative ways of being, and to inspire and encourage people's imaginations to flow freely. Design and speculations can act as a catalyst for collectively defining our relationship to reality. And I was like, wow, I want to do that kind of design, you know? So basically what happens is, instead of thinking about the deliverable, you're thinking about the particular problem-solving process, right? You're thinking about how can I change something that's about to happen by imagining a different space, like a parallel universe, but through design thinking. It's pretty awesome. And of course, black people have been doing it for a long time. So, been doing it for a very long time. So these particular albums, the top 3 are all by Mississippi artists, all rap artists, who actually are doing speculative fiction through their rap songs. So this is 730. Heaven's Computer is basically a thematic album talking about an intergalactic space traveler here to conquer Earth. There's Big Crit with Catalactica. And also David Banner, who actually fairly recently created a speculative fiction video piece about an African superhero called Walking with Gods, right? So my friend Kevin Sipp, we were talking one time, and he said this thing about science fiction was in our music. And he actually makes a point that a lot of times you're looking at these musical soundscapes and you're hearing science fiction, right? Drexia, you're talking about funk music, all of these particular types of narratives are speculative in nature and are being translated in that fashion. Another thing I always loved was this quote from Steven Shaviro from his book Connected, hip hop as a cultural hacking. I was really fascinated by that as well. He basically kind of posits that hip hop always wants to be sampled. It always wants to be replicated in some fashion, and it will take over everything. And obviously it has, right? And so even Goody Mob, kind of went into this, I know, it wasn't that good. I know. She's like, no, man, I know. They went into this Afrofuturist space, all right. And fairly recently at the Grammys, CeeLo reintroduced himself as Gnarly Davidson. I mean, I know, he's like, I have no idea what's going on with that. I'm curious to see where it goes. But here's the thing, it does seem like it's very cyberpunk. But before I get ahead of myself, what is cyberpunk, right? Anybody, so show of hands, cyberpunk? Okay, all right. I'm probably gonna do that some more too with the hand raising thing. It's called call and response. So one of the aspects of cyberpunk is high tech, low life. That is, we can clone people, right? We can maybe take our consciousness and upload it to a computer somewhere, but we've destroyed the planet. And racism still exists, and everything's jacked up, right? So high tech, low life. I found this definition by Eric Schneider that I really like because it talks a lot about marginalized people. A lot of times you don't see that popping up in the definitions. This notion of marginalized people utilizing technology kind of flip the script on corporations. But usually, if you're seeing like cyborgs or different types of ideas about like what consciousness is or what being human is, these are definitely part of like the kind of like cyberpunk aesthetic, so to speak. Blade Runner, for instance, is one of my favorite films. Okay, I'm pretty sure all of you are familiar with The Matrix, right? Or most of you are familiar with The Matrix. Some people more than others. Some people have been in Matrix movies. Anyway, been in Matrix movies. I believe only one of us. Some people. Anyway, so one of my favorite quotes from Blade Runner is Roy Batty, who's a replicant. He's an android. He has Harrison Ford's character, Deckard, hanging from a building about to let him go. And he says, quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it? That's what it means to be, that's what it is to be a slave. So a lot of times, these particular types of metaphorical narratives in cyberpunk are automatically talking about the oppressed people, right? But I'm like, well, let's just make them black. They're always white. I'm like, let's make them of color. That would be awesome. So some of the first stories about cyberpunk started with William Gibson's Neuromancer. Shout out to William Gibson. And also Richard Morgan's Altered Carbon. Altered Carbon is really interesting, but basically like the body is kind of a sleeve and you can upload your consciousness, and if you're really wealthy, you can actually live forever because you can keep like replicating yourself, that kind of thing. And of course, Bruce Sterling, who edited this, the definitive cyberpunk anthology called Mirror Shades, right? And this stuff is jumping off in the 80s when they're positing what a future cyberspace would be. But how does technology change us? Does it actually make us better, or does it make us worse? Is it good to be transhuman, or is it horrible? These types of things. So this particular conference was kind of like a flashpoint for a lot of these ideas I was thinking about. Henry Jenkins, the media scholar, he used to be at MIT, but actually now is at USC. He basically created this conference where he wanted to talk about the legacies of cyberpunk. And so he invited Bruce Sterling, Rudy Rucker, Roger Trilling, Mark Pauline, some of the godfathers of cyberpunk. William Gibson was supposed to come, but of course, he was probably in cyberspace somewhere. And the second panel, though, was Nalo Hopkinson, my colleague, Jordan Mechner, myself, Claire L. Evans, and Alex Rivera. You can go look those folk up, they're pretty awesome. But here's the thing, the first panel was mostly straight, white, older men, who I love. I love their work, great, right? The second panel was very brown, very queer, very female, and this is the future of it, right? So I was invited with Stacey Robinson to talk about my project with him called Black Kirby. Stacey Robinson and I have an avatar/studio/collective called Black Kirby that we were invited to talk about at this conference. And basically, Black Kirby is very influenced by Black visual culture, hip hop, comics, activism, and also Afrofuturism. It was an honor to be at this conference, but the thing I took away from it was the sense of renewed clarity about how my work was still situated in design, just not how I thought it was. And actually, that excited me. It also made me think about, like, what does Black cyberpunk look like, right? It might look like Nalo Hopkinson's work, who is of Jamaican descent and actually was very inspired by cyberpunk when she wrote Brown Girl in the Ring and works of that nature. But it also could look like Samuel Delaney's work as well. If you look at Nova, which was written in '68, which in some ways is a precursor to cyberpunk. This gentleman named Milton J. Davis actually edited this piece called The City, and he calls his kind of type of cyberpunk cyberfunk, right? It's Black cyberpunk. But like the genre from which it gains inspiration, cyberpunk is a genre of speculative fiction centered on transformative effects of advanced science, information technology, computers and networks, And this is where the cyber comes in, coupled with this breakdown of radical change in the social order. But unlike cyberpunk, cyberfunk is expressed through an African or Black lens, right? So I'm thinking of cybertrap as a subgenre of cyberfunk, basically. By the way, this gentleman is based in Atlanta too. I think that there's a really interesting connection between what's going on in like speculative culture and the South, which is what I'm gonna get to in a second. So this gentleman, Bruce Sterling, who is one of the godfathers of cyberpunk, is also, guess what, a designer. And he talks about the future a lot. He's a futurist. And he also writes a lot of science fiction. He's written a lot of science fiction. And he also comes up with this notion of what he calls design fiction, or using diegetic prototypes. So Joseph Lindley and Paul Colton proposed that design fiction should be defined as something that creates a story world, or something that has a prototype thing being created in that story. And basically these particular types of diegetic prototypes are created to basically have a discussion of some kind, or basically elicit a response through creating some type of prototyping piece. So if you've seen something like Minority Report, there are so many diegetic prototypes that were being worked on that were not real, that were actually in that movie, to talk about what the future could be like, right? That's a film with Tom Cruise, by the way. Just like making sure. Okay. I just want to see, I'm geeking out. At the same time I'm thinking about this, I'm also teaching a class on applied semiotics called Race as Science Fiction. I started thinking about this notion of how race is constructed as this kind of like science fictional space, and how much weight it still carries in our particular world. The other thing that was inspired by this cyberpunk conference was this curatorial exercise I did with Dr. Ronaldo Anderson, who is also a leading Afrofuturist scholar, who is also from the South. We curated this piece called Unveiling Visions, The Alchemy of the Black Imagination, in the Lewis Latimer Gallery at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. 4 things were really influential in our curatorial philosophy. One was Sherry Renee Thomas's book Dark Matter, and how she kind of gives us a timeline of Black speculative culture. Kevin Young and his concept of the shadow book, which is extremely fascinating. I'm kind of obsessed with it. Peck's film is an example of the shadow book, I think, as well. The idea of a book that haunts the existence of an existing book, or an unwritten book, right? John Akomfra's trope of the data thief, right? A time-traveling archaeologist that's assembling things. So we're like positing, well, what if he was a curator and not an archaeologist, right? And the other thing is Du Bois's notion of the veil, but instead of it being like this, having the weight of that he's speaking of in this particular piece, we're thinking about the veil as an extension of a type of Black technology, like a different universe that you're actually able to look through. And actually, we were supposed to have augmented reality that was dealing with the artwork, but our programmer was ill, and we weren't able to actually introduce that aspect. And there is going to be a catalog, by the way, Nikki Green. So just so you know, because she asked me about it. This is being designed by Tud Din, one of my former students, and it should be coming out in a few months. So I became really, really excited about the notion of diegetic prototypes. And I started thinking about how this curatorial exercise, coupled with the exposure to concepts around speculative fiction and design, made me start thinking about race as a type of design fiction. We often hear it referred to as a system or a construct, and we construct and consume space around it as if it's a real thing. And I was like, well, what if we looked at race as a designed object? And what if we looked at it as a diegetic prototype? What if we thought about racist systems as very effectively designed deliverables or products that could be redesigned or undesigned? So I kind of cobbled together, and it's still in progress, critical race design studies as a space, which really start to reconnect me to design again. So it's an interdisciplinary design practice that intersects critical race theory, speculative design, design history, and critical making to analyze and critique the effects of visual communication, graphic objects, and their associated systemic mediations of racial identity. So the idea is that through looking at critical notions about how race function, and then actually going through the process and making objects, the process through critical making is you're learning from the process of creating, right? Thinking about how these particular types of graphic ephemera are indexes for a racist system, and then also thinking about the historiography and the theory behind those particular systems and how they function, but then also thirdly thinking about how black artists and designers have taken those particular types of ideas and flipped them on their ears, right? And start to actually get inside of that particular construct and basically remix it. So again, I was really excited about it. Obviously, I'm very excited about the diegetic prototype notion, right? So I started looking for them in literature, and I found a few that we made for this particular show. So what if there was a collection of Afrocentric musical instruments whose music was deadly, but only to white people? So that was from Will the Circle Be Unbroken, written by Henry Dumas in 1965? 66, yeah. Can't read my own typing. What if there was a pair of shoes that allow you to fly? That's in Chowie by Amir Baraka, was written in 1990. What if there was a chair that turned black people into white people? That's Black No More by George Schuyler, it was written in 1931. Well, if there was a device that could actually sense off-duty police officers. That's from a story called The Pig Detector by Amiri Baraka in 2000. So what we did, me and my friend Stacey Robinson together, we started art directing these prototypes to kind of like think about, like, so what would those things actually be, right? The big one, though, is when we were curating that show, Britt Russert and our colleague, that's when they found the Princess Steel in Du Bois's notes. The Princess Steel, written in 1905, about a device that allows you to see through time, space, and other dimensions. So he was writing about the Oculus Rift, right, in 1905. So black people were speculated into existence to a certain degree, and that speculation was supported by generations of visual culture and design to propaganda. Then we, the speculated, have used that same technology to critique society and the persistence of our disenfranchisement. So me and my friend Adeli Funama a couple of years ago co-founded this Afrofuturist think tank called Astro Blackness, and we would do it at Loyola Marymount, and we've done it for a couple of years with different themes. And then I got it in my head after the Cyberpunk conference to think about, well, what's happening in the South? Because I was thinking about, okay, what is Black Cyberpunk? What's going on with these diegetic prototypes? And what's happening with the future of the South? Do you guys think of the South and future in the same sentence? I know you do. I know. I know you do. I mean, seriously, when we think of what are the connotations of the South? It's haunted, it's racist, it's backwards, right? Not forward thinking at all, right? And so we also think about it as a whole, like we kind of glob the South together. We do that for space anyway, right? The spatial narrative is connected to different types of spaces, right? But the South is like this ominous place where we leave our dead, or like the sins of the past are there. We don't want to go down there, right? But I'm from there, right? And so are a lot of other future thinking black people, right? So black Southern folk in particular use the speculative to empower themselves to make a better life. So we came up with this notion of Planet Deep South, and we did a conference that was about 4 days. There was a spinoff of Astro Blackness. This happened last year, I think it was, I forget. Speculative cultural production and Africanisms in the Black American South. So the conference was in the city of Jackson, and it reimagined and pondered the power of black Southern dreams. I was one of the co-organizers along with Rico Chapman, and basically we're looking at people like Bree Newsome, who, by the way, actually also creates speculative fiction, right? Before she snatched the flag off of, she was a filmmaker, and she was making horror stories about the South and black feminist culture, right? Kia Se Lehman is from Mississippi. One of my favorite writers, again, Henry Dumas, is from Sweetwater, Arkansas. Sun Ra hails from Birmingham, Alabama. And Maurice White is from Memphis, Tennessee. You see what I'm getting at, right? These notions of a lot of these particular types of spaces are being imagined from this Southern affirmation or this aspiration. Southern cultural production aimed at the future, and its promise was the central theme, right? So we're also thinking about realigning the spiritual and the spatial narratives around the South as a space connoting the past, and most of the time we think of it as a dark past, right? This is William Johnson. Basically, he was a black arts writer. He was from Mississippi. His most famous work was The Man Who Cried I Am, but he also wrote a time travel narrative too called Captain Blackman that was critiquing the treatment of black soldiers in American wars. Of course, this is Janelle Monáe. John A. Williams, thank you. Thank you. We looked at how black Southern speculative culture critiqued the past and the future, and gives us indexes for surviving the present. There were people from around the world talking about Afrofuturism while sitting at a HBCU eating soul food in the middle of Mississippi. And you kind of missed it. I'm so sorry if you didn't come. But guess what? We created an archive for you. So if you want to go and you can see the Storyfy, you can see everything that we did at the Black Speculative Arts Digital Archive, okay? And the archive was founded by myself and Dr. Kenitra Brooks. So while we're talking about the future in the middle of Jackson, Mississippi, if you go a few blocks over, this is what you'll see, right? Boarded up buildings, really, really damaged infrastructure, right? These notions of urban blight that you wouldn't normally think of when you think about this space, right? And that's one of the reasons why I wanted my colleagues to come down and see that particular space. So at the end of this conference, myself, Regina Bradley, and Professor Stacy Robinson proposed this notion of cybertrap, a speculative, chronologically futuristic narrative that exists within the intersections of Black Southern spaces and the aesthetics of classic trap music culture, not the EDM stuff, mixed with the tropes and thank you, and world-building affordances of Black cyberpunk, AKA cyberfunk. So, I'm talking about early trap music that deals with the trap as a space that's infused with poverty and drug dealing and grime, right? To kind of borrow from DJ Mag, he says the trap just feels dirty. It's that dirty, grimy 808 snare clap. There are only 8 or 9 instruments to make the trap sound, and then the music comes with this gangsta club feel, and the music hypnotizes. And it's a lot like trance music, but it's Southern trance music. And most trap has scary music or some kind of ambiance, right? And sometimes it makes me think of the Twilight Zone, which I thought was an interesting commentary. It makes you feel like you're in a dark dungeon, like you're in the trap itself, right? So trap has not only the very similar anti-establishment, dark and brilliantly experimental music, culture, and attitude as, say, a punk or a funk music, but it also comes along with a spatial narrative that totally fits within the cyberpunk aesthetic. So like a virtual reality, trap is also a state of mind and a constant struggle. And how do you escape your mind? So we kind of did this, Stacy Robinson did this as kind of a mood board to get us to understand what is going on with this space physically to a certain degree. And of course, this is the iconic image of Gordon, whipped slave, with the streets of Jackson being the scars, right? So I'm gonna go through this really quickly, as I wanna field questions. There's this wonderful book by Istvan Szilárdi Ronay Jr., and it's called The 7 Beauties of Science Fiction. And it kind of lays out these 7 tenets of how you can build a really effective science fiction story. So, all right, so this is the part I was talking about. All this is not real, okay? So the first thing you have to do is make up a future history. We're talking about the future. So in 2018 through 2025, there's a massive water war, a civil war, second civil war over water and resources, right? It's called the Esapano River Wars. And basically it's due to a lot of weakening of EPA funding and a lot of fracking that happens in the Midwest, and groundwater gets a little depleted and messed with a little bit there. And there's massive droughts because of climate change, right? Feels a little warm today, doesn't it? I'm just saying. It does. 2024, a massive hurricane, a series of a few, called Tisha, totally devastates the Southeast, right? Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana. It causes a rupture at the Grand Gulf Nuclear Plant in Claiborne County, where my family actually is from. And this rupture actually kind of infests the area with like radiation and other types of waste materials. And because a lot of people who are not financially are actually able to leave the place, they're stuck there, and they're called the folk, and they actually are using those particular types of resources, and they mutate into these different types of monstrous body horrific spaces, right? Let's see. All right, so 2025, this war rages on until a second hurricane comes, and it's called Frida, right? The president is caught off camera while he's basically addressing this crisis while his mic is still hot, and he says, damn, this Hurricane Frida is some bitch. And so he nicknamed it Hurricane, so it became Hurricane Bitch. I'm sorry about that, but that's what it's called. That was her fault. I'm just kidding. All right. So basically, it's the largest hurricane ever in recorded history. So 2026 hack is discovered. This is a cyber drug that actually a lot of things happen around. And the Tech Crimes Task Force is created in 2026. 2027, the first hydrocution plant goes online. Basically, a hydrocution plant turns human bodies into water, right? A tech company named Mamawati Incorporated in San Francisco works with Israel and creates the process that actually makes very, very cheap desalination processes, right? Also in 2027, the Left Union, which is like the West, they basically secede from the Union, and they create a force field called the Thirsty Curtain. All right, then the first annual Bitch Fest happens, right? So basically Bitch Fest is created in New Jackson to raise morale and also to raise money. It becomes a huge tourist attraction. Also, the first woman governor and the first black woman, her name is Hyacinth Northington, is elected in 2028 to be governor of the state of Mississippi. 2029, Noah and Adriana Darling create this space called North Star Media and begin publishing an interactive digital anthology service called Electric Revival. And yes, that is influenced by Outkast, yes. 2032, hack becomes legalized. So up until this point, we're talking about something that's very similar to the Prohibition era, okay? So we call it the proscription era. So this is the end of the proscription era. And then of course, 2045 I just threw in there because Ray Kurzweil in 2006, I believe, basically said that the singularity will occur in 2045, and that is when an AI, artificial intelligence, will come into being and then wipe us out, right? You've seen The Matrix, right? So, other thing I want to talk about is fictive novums right quick. Hack is a cyber drug that is found on the dark web, and it's a strain of code that affects computers and humans. And the code can be realigned and cut into different sections, and it's highly addictive, and it can become different types of drugs because it's a smart drug. So, and it also affects computers as well. So basically, what happens is after the proscription era, it becomes legalized, and it brings in a lot of tax money into the state of Mississippi. So I was thinking about what does hack look like. So I was really influenced by the Matrix Code when I did this, and this is based off of a project that I did with Dr. Akita Carey, who is a choreographer. Any choreographers, dancers? Right, okay. You guys take composition classes, right? Dance composition, which I think is very interesting. Choreography literally means dance writing, which I think is also fascinating. And they also come up with movement vocabularies. So those are all writing terms. So what I was trying to do is actually think about how the body movement becomes a writing system. So what we did is we actually, me and my friend Deborah Dudley, would put lights all over Dr. Carey and shot her at low shutter speed, right? Which leaves a light trail. So then what we did is I actually sampled pieces from the light trail and I made a syllabary, so a sign system that can actually be turned into a typeface. So hack is a typeface that is also like this, acting as this computer code, right? Hydrocution, again, it's kind of self-explanatory. It's a method of execution that drives out the human body and basically turns the body in the human, the water in the human body into water. This is highly influenced by Soylent Green, the movie Soylent Green, if you've seen it. It's very disturbing, sorry. I was thinking also about new religions too. So the Church of the Loving System is basically this notion of people who are wanting to upload themselves into the technosphere, right, when the AI becomes sentient. So they believe that this particular occurrence will be a godlike or a divine moment, and they want to actually be a part of it. So it's called the Church of the Loving System. They're called the Natarians, right? We also have this religious order called the Friedenites, right? So they basically worship Hurricane Frida as an aspect of Oya, right? And they think that a third hurricane is going to come through and basically cleanse the earth and whisk them away to heaven, right? One of my favorite constructions that we're still working on, Dr. Bradley's doing this piece called Dilapidated Woods. It's going to explore the background of this radicalized Christian black nationalist leaning religious organization that is also a fully functioning tactical military unit. They're called the Benediction, and they are not to be played with. Okay, so this stuff again is still in flux. Imaginary technology. So you guys familiar with bioplastics? The idea of taking like plants and different types of root systems and making them into different types of plants, into type of plastics. So there's this weed, this giant weed called kudzu that is all over the South, right? And once I found out about bioplastics, I was like, well, why not take kudzu and actually take that and make it into bioplastics, right? Someone is doing it. I did some research on it the other day. Someone is actually starting to do that because kudzu actually has a lot of starch in it, so it can make a really strong and flexible bioplastic. So KFAB becomes an industry that is generated out of the trap by kudzu farmers. I also have this thing called INC. It stands for Interactive Nano-Organic Cosmic Computer. I like acronyms. I'm sorry, I'm a geek. Basically, it's a living computer that is also like a tattoo that can actually change shape and things according to him. So basically, it becomes like a personal computer that actually can change shape at a whim. One of my favorite things too is how computers are changing, right? So MotherWit, or WIT, stands for Wireless Interactive Technosphere, right? So the sphere is a global network of tiny little nanocomputers that if you have a subscription to, that you can actually make things from. So you say, mother, I need a screen, and it just pops up. Because basically what's going to happen is the computer's going to disappear. It's going to be either in our bodies or everywhere. That's probably what's going to happen, right? Well, it's already starting with Alexa, right? One of my favorite things is Skeeta. You ever been bitten by like Mississippi mosquitoes? It's like the size of hummingbirds. Anyway, so I wanted to make something that was inspired by them. So I have this thing called the sequential triconic aneurysm. It's a computer virus that affects, again, human bodies and machines, right? This is something me and my friend Damien Duffy came up with. So basically, once you get the virus from using like a dirty hack inhaler or whatever, you see these three images, like a week apart, right? And then as the virus progresses, you see them closer and closer and closer and closer until they start flickering, and then you have an aneurysm. Okay, sorry. So it's called a Skeeta. Then, of course, it's allergies. So because, again, design is naturalized, y'all laughing at, okay. This is like literally being allergic to advertisements. So this is, and I totally cribbed this from Pattern Recognition by William Gibson, which is pretty awesome. There's a character that's allergic to logos, right? Okay, so haintware. Haintware is basically a technology that allows you to upload your consciousness into the space. Deja vu. Deja vu is a glitch that can happen when bad haintware, in a bad haintware system, and you're actually remembering someone else's, so it's called deja vu. Veil tech. Veil tech is a tech that's created by the folk to make themselves look normal, right? It's super expensive, but it's created by the folk to actually kind of pass, and so they can actually basically make a better life for themselves. The shooks. So here's the thing. So if you have too many nanobots that you've inhaled from hack, they can build up, right? Sometimes they don't biodegrade, and you get these kind of lesions, and then you might go brain dead, right? So what ends up happening is the police force, to save money, takes these bodies, like in the Matrix, and puts them inside of cyborgs, and they're called the shooks. And so they're basically like there's a cybernetic police force called the shooks that actually police the trap. One thing that's really interesting, you guys do any research on the cannabis industry right now? You know, in California, right? So one of the things that's really interesting, my wife told me about actually, is the fact that they have a lot of cash laying around because it's a state law and not a federal law, right? So actually FDIC supported banks, right? You cannot take the money that you've been making as a cannabis dealer and put them into banks because the banks will be charged with money laundering because it's still illegal, right? So what we did is we created kind of like this Bitcoin style currency called Jax. And this is designed by Chris Lee. So this is like the symbol for Jax. So basically what happens is dealers in the trap can actually use this particular type of monetary unit. He actually did some falsified their stock systems, which I thought was pretty cool. That's Jax. Hackstar. So basically, because hack is legal, you can actually like have couture or like, you know, paraphernalia that you can just buy. So everybody wants to fly as couture. So this guy named Gideon Strumpet creates this paraphernalia. He's actually a hack dealer as well, but he's also like a gangster clothing designer, right? So what I was thinking about with this is that J.R.R. Tolkien, when he created The Lord of the Rings, he based a lot of his ideologies around the language. He was a linguist, right? So I was thinking, well, what if we actually took design and made that the central idea and started building this notion of a design space? Trinity. You always have to have a really, really evil corporation to fight against. Trinity is like if Monsanto, Nestle, and Viacom had a kid, right? So some people are trying to escape the trap by virtual reality, so they have these like Trinity helmets on and stuff, right? Electric revival, right? Like power, music, electric revival. That's from Bombs Over Baghdad. It's from Bombs Over Baghdad, right? So this was designed by Chris Lee. When we were creating this world, I got the notion like, man, I would love to have a superhero story in the trap. Or I would love to have a horror story in the trap. And then we were like, that would not work, wouldn't work. So we created this magazine, this fictitious magazine that was created by people who live in the trap as a hopeful space where people can dream while they're in the trap. So I remember this notion that Dr. West was talking about, this idea of being a prisoner of hope, right? So I was talking to two of my former students, the Bryces, Talamika and Charles Bryce, and I was asking, I was like, why are you still in that space? Like, what do you love about that space? She said, well, this is my home, right? This is where I grew up. I want my son Honor, by the name, his name is Honor, to grow up. And they own a design company there, they own a publishing company there, and I was like, they're prisoners of hope. They're the space, that's the space that was missing. And so what I did is I want to base characters off of the Bryces and actually have them be the creators of Electric Revival. And so in Electric Revival, we can actually have all these different stories that are happening in the trap as a meta story without disturbing the world that we've already built, right? And here are some of the stories that will happen there. Some other things, the Tech Crimes Task Force, also known as Device Squad. Floods, right? So there's a lot of climate change, it's always raining and stuff like that, so you're gonna need some really fly boots, you need some really nice rain gear. So these two companies are the main companies that deal with that. Another thing, there's this gentleman named Philip Rollins, who I admire greatly. He's a DJ. He owns probably he's definitely one of the only black comic book retailers in the country. There's only a handful of them. But he basically set up shop in the middle of downtown Jackson. He has a space called Offbeat. So I actually want to create a character based off of this particular character. Now, this young man, not only is he a business owner there, but he's creating dreams there. So people come there and they congregate there and they actually create like a community space there, and I want to just honor him and create a space for him. Also, one of my former students, Marcus Williams, he calls himself 730. And he basically takes these really awesome, like, space influenced narratives in his work. He's a very talented MC. JSI, I'm a proud Tiger. I went to Jackson State, taught at Jackson State, right? So I was thinking that when this sister becomes governor, right, she takes a lot of the tax money and she builds up all of the infrastructure for the educational programs. Kind of like what happened with the Ayers case, right, where we got more money from the Ayers decision. So Jackson State University becomes Jackson State Institute. So imagine like this really, really amazing research institution in the middle of this like mega city, right? Because what happens is all these people move from Florida and other spaces into Jackson and it becomes like a giant mega city. So the science fictional sublime is obviously the singularity, right? The idea of this computer entity becoming so powerful that it becomes divine. Scary, but Kurzweil said it might jump off. The science fictional grotesque, see, that's a geek laugh. The trap games. So basically, the trap games are happening in the Mississippi Coliseum, very much like Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, where people who are poor, the folk are fighting for money, food, what have you, at the behest of the upper class, right? And it's illegal up until a point, right? And this is some scenes from that. The folk, of course, they represent the science fictional grotesque, the symbolic physiognomy of like the downtrodden in that particular space. Last one, the technologiad. It's basically the hero's journey, right? So when we were first conceptualizing this space, we're talking about this character named Blanca, who basically runs the trap. She basically is born in a small southern town called a fictitious space called Crescent, and she ends up going to the trap, and she ends up becoming a very, very talented, brutal trap fighter, and then she ends up running the trap, right? The first story about her is going to be in Regina Bradley's collection of short stories from the Hip Hop South, Boondock Collage. It's going to be coming out soon. I know, right? Yes. Next character was Deck. Deck is basically an ex-soldier who has computer abilities, and he becomes a cutter for Blanca, right? And so a lot of the stories will be about him. The first story about him just dropped in Obsidian at AWP, right? And basically it's called Trap Whispers, and it's about his being inaugurated into the trap game. And here are some character studies of him. The project I'm working on right now is Cell Therapy Rumble Dogs, which features this woman who is she's from the folks, and she used to be a trap fighter. Then she becomes kind of a bounty hunter, and they call her Babyface because she has a little face like right here, right? And she basically becomes the protagonist of this particular story. She becomes a farmer and has to be drawn back into the trap to actually track down these kind of augmented super soldiers by the federal government. So that's it. That's all I got to tell you about. Welcome to the trap. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much. All right, 1 o'clock. Yeah? All right. So any questions about this crazy insanity?
That's great, man. So what happens now?
Well, like I said, the first 2 stories are going to come out. Right now we're working on probably building like a transmedia space. So we want to do like maybe an RPG space. The idea is to create the rules so that anybody can kind of interact with the stories. You know? At first we were thinking about just doing it as like an illustrated book piece. But I was talking to one of my publishers, and he was like, that'd be a dope RPG. And I was like, okay, well, let's try to do that, you know. So I think that's the next idea too. I have other collaborators that are actually helping me build some of the stuff that's in the electric revival space. So I want to work on those as well. So I'm working on this, but also several other projects right now at Hutchins Center. So
Well, that's great. Questions, comments? It's fabulous.
thank you. There's a gentleman in the back.
I want to thank you for shouting out the Jackson hip hop scene because they got a lot of positive stuff going on down there.
Yeah, you do.
And a lot of people don't know that. I love the undertones of like trap music and science fiction. That's like my whole MO as an artist myself. Can you talk more about how the challenges of developing, merging those worlds in a world that practically can't really see that? Those are 2 different universes to a lot of people.
That's right. So it's funny because like as a designer, you always try to figure out connections. I think a lot of times we're trained to look at what's different in each other, right? So when I started thinking about a cultural space, a black cultural space, and how it would relate to cyberpunk, I was like, I think that a lot of the influences from that particular space, from trap culture, would actually fuse together. So I started doing research on both ends. And also, I called in one of the dopest trap scholars to help create the space, Dr. Bradley, right? And so I think that right now in the developmental space is to try to find as many connections as possible in those spaces and then actually start producing the work. I think the next step is actually finishing this particular piece and then getting it, released widely or into a space where everyone can see it. Because I think that because of the digital nature of both cultures, that we can actually put it up as, digitally published books, as blogs. Actually, like for instance, Dilapidated Woods is going to be a blog. The other thing is that when you're doing a world building project, you have to make sure that every aspect of it is pretty tight. So for instance, even though like Chris Lee was making like these fictitious, market reports, they start to give you like a kind of like a sort of undergirding, like a formation for you to focus on. So things like that I think are really, really good to actually find as many connections as possible and to get it out on a wider platform. So I want to get this work out, published in different spaces. But it's already starting to happen because those 2 stories are coming. Well, one is already out, so. JC?
Thanks, John. I mean, that was just a hurricane of creativity.
I
and
see what you
amazement.
did there.
Just gonna also show my own geekness by saying you had Blanca, which is a Street Fighter character with a cybernetic arm, which is what Jax has in Mortal Kombat. But you, of course, know that already. All right.
Yeah.
One thing I found really fascinating is the way in which Hack is also a language,
Yeah.
or each kind of sign becomes its own letter,
Yes.
and then it becomes a kind of language. And the relation that your project's genesis has to poets and to writers who have wielded language to kind of create these spaces that you're then kind of using to speculate on and kind of think back onto it. And I'm kind of reminded too of Delaney. You mentioned Sam Delaney.
Dahlgren?
Well, Babel 17,
17,
because she's a poet, right? And that's part of, and there's also those kinds of Thunderdome fights that happen in that world. And she, part of her power is that she can wield language in that way. And it's one of those kind of speculative spaces where people who can control language, like poets, have a special kind of relation to the power and the politics in that world. And what part of how you ended your presentation on with that family that represents hope, alongside the invention of, was it Electric Revival?
Yeah, Electric Revival.
For like stories to be kind of created within the speculative world. Yeah, I'm just wondering if you want to talk more about the status of language, of hack, and the characters inside your world that might become, characters of hope through language, because of, it seems to kind of related to the whole genesis of it.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so when I was thinking about like how hack would kind of come to play, right? I love the idea that the typeface, which is called Jukia, which I could send to you, right, is based off of a Caribbean feminine body language, right? I love that idea. So what I was thinking is that not only does it represent hack, but also we have this notion that we're working on called trap speak. The idea of all these different, these different cultures coming together and actually like creating this language, right? And I'm thinking that hack will actually be trap speak as well. So like you, I like the fact that there is a visual representation of it and that you can actually take pieces of language and actually re-encode it. So I think that a lot of the trap speak aspect will probably be in the regular world. I haven't really thought a lot about how trap speak is or hack coding will actually end up in these other worlds, but because that's a new thing actually. Seriously, I've been working on this up to the minute. I was like, oh, that's a good idea, So I haven't had a chance to think about that. But some of the stories, the most hopeful I think is this gentleman called The Struggle, right? So The Struggle is a superhero that's actually based in a trap. His great grandfather was a Baptist preacher who was lynched, right? His great grandmother, his wife, sees this lynching, right? She's a conjure woman, and so what she does, she captures his soul in the branch that he's lynched on. That's the weapon that the struggle carries. So he has a piece of the branch that his ancestor died on as a weapon, and then when she passes away, the cloth that she's wrapped in becomes bulletproof. It becomes superpowered, that kind of thing. So this is passed down from generation to generation to generation, and he's called The Struggle. And again, we don't know who that particular character is. We know there's a mantle that's passed down from generation to generation. And his villain is called the Murder, like a murder of crows. So he represents the embodiment of Jim Crow in the trap. So,
But that's a riff on Poe Sandy by Charles Chestnut.
oh,
You know that short story?
mm-mm.
Oh, you got to read it. She turns her lover, her husband, into a tree
Oh, wait a minute, that does sound
to protect him. And while she's off one day, they chop the tree down. It's a really sad story.
oh my God. I probably love it then. I
Yeah,
love
but
sad
you would-
stories. I love sad
but it's
stories.
very much that idea.
Yeah.
Well, that raises the issue of intertextuality, which you
Yeah.
said you really like hip hop because of sampling.
That's right.
But that's the nature of art.
That's
It's intertextual. Certainly, all literature is about intertextuality. Eliot's. I don't know if you ever read Eliot's essay called "Tradition and the Individual Talent," which is about intertextuality. And what he says is that all works of literature form a simultaneous order and a simultaneous existence, meaning basically you could be started with James Joyce's Ulysses, published in 1922, and you had all the books that it riffs on back to Homer's Odyssey, which obviously it's a Ulysses Odyssey, it's a rewrite. They would all fall down like dominoes, that they're all speaking to each other backwards and forwards. So my question is, how, and obviously, if you read the Odyssey, if you had a blindfold test, which in my graduate training we had to do. They were just passages, and you had to identify who wrote it, when.
Wow.
Yeah. It was
That's rough.
serious shit. That's the way it was. They were not joking.
No.
And so obviously, if you took a blindfold test and you saw a passage of Homer's Odyssey and James Joyce's Ulysses, only an idiot would not know that it was 2,000 years apart or whatever. Mm-hmm. When you do a graphic novel like Kindred,
Right.
you're riffing on, you're not just putting pictures in a book, you change the book.
That's right.
So what is the relationship of your version of Kindred to Octavia's version of Kindred?
Okay. Well, first thing is that when we were adapting it, it had to be shortened quite a bit. We had the daunting task of editing Octavia Butler,
Right.
which is extremely painful, right? Because every word that she created is necessary. If you know anything about her writing, it's extremely terse, it's very direct, and it's beautifully painful to a certain degree. It's just, right? So one of the first things we had to do was think about, okay, the length of the book. We don't have enough space to actually try to create that. The other thing is that Kindred it's not linear. It's a time travel story, right? And so it's kind of bouncing all over the place, and you're trying to figure out exactly the memories that Dana's talking about that's the protagonist that she's having. So one of the things we had to do is actually try to pull out those two timelines and figure out how to get those particular types of linearities across. The other thing is that the mechanism for time travel, right? Butler refers to Kindred as a grim fantasy. It's not a science fiction story. I kind of posit it as what I call the ethnogothic, a space where we're looking at race and also this notion of the Gothic, which is something that myself and Dr. Carpenter were talking about.
Yeah, and some people would say the Gothic was ethnicized even when the Gothic was the Gothic.
That's right, that's right. I mean, you can see different aspects of the trope of the Gothics. Like, for instance, the doppelganger, right? When you look at Alice and Dana, right? So it has that particular aspect. So dealing with the time travel piece we tried to do that through a reification of the color, right? So if you look at the book, what we wanted to do is actually focus on the vividness that Butler talks about in the novel of the past. So we actually did that in full color, right? And so in the present, which is 1976, we actually made it monochromatic, so that when she's shifting from one time to the other, because they're just moving into that new house in California, that's not really her home. That's not really their home. But when she's going backwards, and it becomes really vivid and it becomes more powerful for her, we wanted that to be a piece that actually she kind of talks about in the story. We wanted to make that really part of it. The other thing that was really difficult to deal with, because of the interiority of the Butler novel, or the original novel, you can deal with pain in particular, with the interior idea of how she feels when she's about to travel, the physical aspects of the travel. That particular aspect of the horror of slavery had to be translated to the page as much as we could, and that was actually a lot more daunting than I had realized. There's a part in the novel where she witnesses her first whipping, right? She's in the bushes and she can hear this man being beaten within an inch of his life, right? And the way that Butler describes it is so, it's extremely brutal, right? And I found myself actually weeping onto the pages when I was making that particular scene. And I actually found myself having to go back to that place to finish those particular pages later, because it was so visceral, So those were some of the challenges, and you wanted to make sure that you have the core of the story and that it becomes its own thing, because it is graphic, right? And you also want to make sure that the affect of what she was talking about how slavery still affects us now, is still part of the narrative.
But she had passed by the time you...
Oh, yes. Yeah, she...
Would she like it?
Some of her close friends said that she would. We talked to her family. We actually met her cousin, which we were thinking, there's a cousin in the book, right? We thought that her name's Ernestine. We thought that maybe that might have been her. But yeah, so we've gotten feedback that she would have liked it, yeah. But she was, okay. You get a mic.
Not okay? Thank you. I didn't think I was that loud. And I want you to know I have my steampunk glasses.
Oh,
so, just to be. I mean, I enjoyed this so much, John. This is awesome. And I was thinking that in order to have a speculative South, you also have to have a North to which it's sort of juxtaposed.
Right.
And I was thinking, if I understood in their narrative, that the North secedes.
Oh no, the West.
The West?
West
Okay,
secedes,
from
yeah.
the Northwest, so I conflate them.
Yeah.
But how do you reconfigure secession? Is it along the same sort of prejudicial lines, or is there a different sort of perspective from this?
Well, this is something that actually is a new addition. Like again, this is in flux. I'm actually talking to folks like Stanford Carpenter about like the world around the piece, as far as like how that would be legislated. Would California break in half? I don't even know. This is something that we've talked about quite a bit. So as far as like the racial pieces, I think it's going to be more about like belief structure and just the idea of human survival to a certain degree. You know, like you cannot have our water. I'm sorry. Go kick rocks. You know, some people, it might be like that. You know, it might be that simple. Because honestly, I'm thinking that the secession happens because they're like, you know what? You went to war with us. We got our water now. Bye. It might be that simple. It might be that simple. We out, exactly. Because now, since they work with Israel to get this technology, you know, human nature is really petty. We're kind of bitter and petty, I'm sorry, and very tribal. So I could see that totally happening, right? But we need to actually think about the other spaces. I mean, most of the concentration has been building to trap up, you know, because I still don't even know what the city looks like yet. I have some ideas, you know, as far as like what that might be like, but we're still, you know, doing a lot of the world building. So, yeah, is that okay? He was in.
All right, thank you very much. Brilliant and beautiful work, and it's very inspiring.
Thank you.
I'm curious, all your examples have been in the South, within the U.S., and I'm curious about the possible relationship of this to other spaces, Caribbean spaces like Brazil, Trinidad, Haiti, Cuba, where there's a lot of mythology, African derived, that's been passed down through generations.
Right.
And could you talk a little bit about that? I'm thinking of in terms of Euro-Americans projecting mythology through spacecrafts, Apollo, instead of Ogun or something.
Right.
So could you talk about that a little bit, please?
Well, here's the thing. So there are some characters, like for instance, Bokor Assassin, right, who is in the electric revival space that actually is connected to some of those traditions. The other thing too is that hack itself is directly related to Caribbean body movements and translations as well, which we thought would be really interesting to do that. One of our previous graphic novels that we got the idea of the Church of the Living System actually looks at like a kind of a neo-voodoo space, or a basically, oh my God, the whole is so crazy to explain. It's basically about, it's based off of Mumbo Jumbo to a certain degree by Ishmael Reed. Yeah, it's almost like it's highly influenced by Ishmael Reed's Mumbo Jumbo, where you have Papa Legba or Papa Labas in that particular case, as kind of like a detective, actually. And I actually did like a poster based off of Just Grew. I don't know if you're familiar with the novel. Yeah, so I did a Just Grew poster, yeah. It's like a biohazard poster, yeah. Yeah. Oh, definitely, yeah. Yeah, so I was thinking about that a lot as far as like this notion of like the global South to a certain degree, but not as much as I need to. But there's some pieces of that in there. Like for instance, the Black Hair is based off of Brer Rabbit stories. Right? So there's going to be like, so imagine like Brer Rabbit as a superhero, that kind of thing, which of course is directly related to those other trickster figures from the Caribbean and other spaces. So we're thinking about it a little bit, but not as we could always do better in that space. Oh, wait a minute. That was.
Oh, yes, no, Brother John, Professor Jenny, that was just brilliant, though, man. I'm just overcome with so many different levels, dimensions, aspects, and facets of what you had to say. It's going to take me days to try to get it together. So I just want to thank you, though, man. But first, I have a historical note. That is to say that the word futurism, people usually associate with Italian futurists, most of whom became Italian fascists. You know, and there's Julian Evola, who's a favorite writer of Stephen Banner right now, the crypto-fascist right down the hall from the Oval Office. His favorite writer is an Italian, began as an Italian futurist. Right. So that Afro-futurist, which is anti-fascist, is implicit indictment of it, but an appropriation of the term. Is that right?
I would think so. I think that when Mark Derry coins it in like the early '90s, that he was basically thinking about it. Cause this is like when cyberculture was jumping off.
We're just taking off. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
Exactly. So he was thinking about it in that particular space. But as I said, I mean, he was basically naming something that black people have been doing for a very long time. So I think, you know, we've been thinking about it as a black speculative arts movement or black
Yes,
speculative
yes.
arts production space.
Yes.
Another reason why me and my friend Dr. Nama were thinking about Astro Blackness is because that actually directly relates to Sunrise Astro Black and that notion of how he was thinking about the dark, grimy spaces and the futuristic spaces through his music.
Oh,
so,
that's beautiful.
So we've been thinking
That's
about like
beautiful.
ways to either reappropriate Afrofuturism from that space or to come up with different like names for things. Like I have issues, we have a lot of issues with the term Afrofuturism for different
But then
reasons.
I think it's incumbent upon you to give us a thicker genealogy of where you are in the history of black people, because you got Coltrane's Interstellar Space, you got Sun Ra, you got Mary Lou Williams, you got a number of folk who have explored this, but then it goes all the way back to the religious practices, African religious, Islamic, Christian, and so forth and so on, how it's been critically appropriated, enriched in relation to new machines, new automation, new forms of technology, but also utopian possibilities. How can black folk get out of these traps?
That's right, that's right. You know, it's funny you mentioned that because my friend Stacey Robinson that I created Black Kirby with, one of his current projects is trying to take these kind of black musical heterotopic spaces and imagine them as black utopias, or to try to like reify them through making, like what does Prince's erotic city actually look like, right? Or what does ghetto heaven actually look like? These types of spaces, you know. Where's the mothership coming from? So here's the thing. So that's right. Yeah, I mean, so that's the thing. It's like, so all these different types of speculations, right? So let me see. I lost my train of thought. Oh, the class I was teaching, for instance, on race as science fiction. One of the projects that I had them do was actually take African written language, particularly the Mende syllabary, because it looks so much like computer code, and actually build blueprints of the mothership. Like, what does it actually look like? Doing like diegetic prototypes of the bop gun. You know, what does that actually feel like? What does that look like? And actually doing cosplay as like, you know, the data thief. You know, what does that kind of look like? So just kind of touching on these different cultural pieces and working through a lot of these ideas around how race is constructed through the speculative. You know, so that's something that we're dealing with a lot. So a lot of these conversations are about not only like the future, but also like how do we actually use the speculative to kind of like cathartically deal with these types of, this kind of like racialized baggage that we're dealing with too. So I hope that was good.
Hi. Oh. Yeah, so you thank you, one, for a brilliant talk. I had a question about two terms you used in the beginning that really grabbed me. So one was cli-fi, this idea of a kind of climate fiction.
Yes.
And the second was a high-tech, low life.
Yes.
Right. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how in a moment marked not just by climate change, but climate catastrophe, right? We can turn to both the black aesthetic tradition, but also contemporary black designers and black makers for instruments to sort of survive the end of the world, right? And whether the dirt and dirty South is also a kind of ecological imperative, right? Like whether we can study these people that have already lived through tremendous devastation in order to imagine a different world and a different order.
That reminds me of this book. Oh shoot, who wrote this book? It's called, I think it's Survive, Gather, Scatter. Oh shoot, what's the name of this book? Anybody know this book I'm talking about? It's a book and it's called like Survive, Learn, Scatter, or something, and then reemerge. It's basically what it is. And I'm totally jacking up the title. And I just saw it the other day when I was thinking about this talk. And so the whole piece is about different types of historical practices that we've done throughout history as a people, as a human species, right? Okay, see, that's a real thing. Okay, let him know. Yeah, I think it's so basically it's different types of practices that we've done as far as like we learn from the experiences, we reemerge, and we kind of, you know, basically change how we do things, hopefully, right? So that's the first thing I think about is like what are these other systems that we've used to do that, right? Because you know, the whole idea of cli-fi is basically like it's a warning message, right? When I was reading on speculative design or speculative everything, there's a section called like dark design. So they're mentioning the fact, and this is really interesting to me, because it's kind of a privileged space where they're talking about like design usually is talking about the nice stuff. Like we talk about the things that we make things orderly, right? We don't really talk about the dark, scary stuff. But he was saying that, you know, through dark design is what they called it, we can actually like access some of these more lurid subjects, right? But I was thinking that as black designers and black artists, that's something that's implicit to us, because I think that if you're in an oppressed space, that you're going to automatically start trying to solve those problems, right? That you're going to actually turn design into a liberation technology, right? That's what I think, you know. So it made me chuckle a little bit, you know. So as far as like the high-tech, low-life piece, that's just it's a description of like how cyberpunk functions as kind of like an aesthetic, you know. So basically, again, we can actually do all these almost mystical things with technology, but the culture has been degraded by our very nature. Because this is a lot of whole piece. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Scatter, adapt, and remember how humans will survive a mass extinction. Yep, that's the one I was talking about. And it disappeared because I jacked it up. So it did not survive. Anyway. Yeah, but so that's what I was referring to. But Cli-Fi is a really interesting space, and there's been a lot of that. You know, I think that I want to go back and read Sister Smith's Orleans, though. I didn't want it to kind of contaminate my thoughts about it, but maybe I should go ahead and read it just so I can have it in my head, right? Because there is also like a massive hurricane that destroys New Orleans, and there's a wall built, so similar themes, you know. Yeah, it's by Sherry L. Smith.
There's time for one more question.
I'm gonna go to.
Thank you. This has been like a really big affirmation for me, and I think a lot of other people in this room who maybe like grew up listening to trap music or have had family members, close family members who have grew up with those experiences, but also be like intensely into Doctor Who.
Yes.
So
like it's kind of scary. Like
right,
my
so,
wife just made me some Doctor Who pants. They were awesome. Seriously.
That's cool.
Yeah,
I want to see those. And so for me, somebody who's begun to dream about and even start to write about inklings of these stories, this is really cool. And so I guess my question is, what advice do you have for undergraduates or even younger trying to get into this space that's not really well established, or how did your career start in this field?
Oh, wow. You're talking about just speculative fiction or just
I think the Afrofuturism cyber trap field in itself. Yeah.
Oh, that's still being created. I think that's hilarious to me. It's like it's still a thing that's being like built. As far as like Afrofuturism, I actually did this series called Matters of the Fact, and it was looking at like the black cyborg, and I was using it as a metaphor for like racism and stereotyping, which of course comes from the printing industry, right? So I was thinking about the fleshy part of the cyborg being the real, and the cybernetic part being like the constructed idea. And so I did about 70 of these images talking about racism, you know, and stereotypes. And then a friend of mine, Dana Rush, she said, that looks really Afrofuturist. And I was like, what is that? And so from then, I just started doing a lot of research on it, and I actually started thinking about, okay, what are these different kind of cultural points for it? And then I inadvertently became like a cover artist for a lot of these different Afrofuturist books, and became part of the conversation and started creating spaces like Astro Blackness and Planet Deep South to continue the conversation. So that's my short, truncated answer to that. As far as like the Cybertrap piece, we're building it at the Hutchins Center. I mean, it's happening right now. So yeah. Even the stories that we've already put out are already, you know, we've already edited those. You know, I mean, they're already changing. You know.
I'll be teaching Kindred in a couple weeks.
Oh wow.
I teach it every year.
Well,
so maybe I'll sign yours and have you come defend it.
Oh, here we go. Oh, that sounds like fun.
That would be fun.
Yeah, I was actually kidding. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Seriously, I appreciate it. All right.